Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's ISDP Forum. Today we're going to discuss whether there's hope or not for democracy in Turkey. I have a very good panel here with me today. I have Dr. Bilge Yabancı from Stockholm University's Institute for Turkish Studies, ISDP's Halil Karaveli. He is a senior fellow and editor of the Turkey Analyst, and also Dr. Svante Cornell, director of ISDP. First of all, let me say that if you're tweeting from today's event, feel free to use our hashtag and to tag us. Oops. And you can find them both on the screen behind me here. We will begin today's forum with a moderated Q&A session before moving on to an open Q&A. I would like to encourage you to take advantage of the panel that we have here today. So if you have any questions on Turkey, I'm sure they will be happy to answer. So Svante, I would like to begin by turning to you and asking you what the current state of democracy is in Turkey.
Well, I think there are many ways to answer that question. I think probably the most important thing to point out is that you have a formal system and then there's an informal system of government. The formal system of government we can all follow in indices, in reports by Freedom House and many other organizations. We know what the changes in legislation have been, and we can obviously see, we can count in rankings and in numbers of journalists that are jailed, increasing issues regarding whether elections in Turkey proceed according to democratic norms or not. That's an interesting discussion, definitely. I think the more interesting discussion is what is happening behind the scenes, namely, what is the informal political development and situation in the country, where, in spite of, I think it's important to point out two things. Number one, and I know Halil Karaveli can speak more about this, we have a very large focus on Erdogan and his personality, what he does and what he doesn't do. But there are many more things happening in Turkey than Tayyip Erdogan. There are many more factors, external factors, structural factors, factors related to geopolitical situation surrounding the country, affecting and in many ways limiting Mr. Erdogan's choices and decisions. Just as an anecdote, I spoke to an old friend in Turkey yesterday who is by no means an Erdogan supporter, who is a secularist person, foreign educated, the typical Istanbul, so-called white Turks as they're known. And he told me, we need the president. And I was surprised. And I said, why? And he said, we need the president to remove all the vestiges of the Gülenist conspiracy from the state. And we have moved on from this. There was a coup a year and a half ago that most agree was led by this Gülen movement. We have focused on what happened after that coup, namely on the restrictions, the very obvious restrictions on freedom of expression and so forth. But for many Turks, this is not the most important point. They are faced between, if you will, bad choices. Erdogan is not a good choice, but to a lot of people, it's more important to get rid of the octopus-like conspiracy of the Gülenist movement than to get rid of Erdogan. And there is a fear that if Erdogan is not there, this conspiracy will come back. So that's just one element among many things that I think we need to keep in mind. And another one, which is also important in my mind, is that in spite of a referendum that ushered in a presidential system, Turkey will not actually, legally speaking, have a presidential system of government until the next presidential election. Which means that everything that is happening in Turkey today is illegal. Every decision that is taken, every decree, every time Erdogan calls up an undersecretary in some ministry ordering to do one thing or another, that's illegal. Because that circumvents the actual chain of command and the bureaucracy, which means that you have a much more vulnerable and much more complex situation in many ways than what it appears to be. That's not a full answer to your question, but maybe a start.
Okay, thank you so much. So Halil, I'd like to turn to you now and just ask you, how strong is President Erdogan's grip on power?
maybe not as strong as many outsiders, many people in the West assume that it is, at least I would say. He is riding a tiger, and as long as he can stay on the tiger, he is safe. But no, remember, if you had asked me that question, if anyone had asked that question, actually no one, it didn't occur to anyone to ask the question before July 15, 2016. The very notion that a coup could take place in Turkey, that Erdogan's power could be threatened, appeared totally. It was a non-question, and then we know what happened. A coup attempt did take place, and Erdogan it was a very narrow escape for Erdogan. So this means that this should teach us something, that all of us who assume that Erdogan's grip on power was extremely strong before July 15, 2016, should be a little careful about making the same mistake today, just by judging by the way he has acted, as Svante said, after the coup attempt. Now, what the coup attempt did was that it broke apart the Turkish state. It fractured the state. The Turkish state is not a broken state, but it's a severely weakened state after the civil war between the Gülenists and Erdogan. And the military, the main pillar of the Turkish state, is weakened after this. Hundreds of people were killed, and when soldiers fought against each other, and soldiers and policemen fought against each other. So what we have is actually a very weakened state. Erdogan is ruling over a very weakened state. The question is, of course, the question can be answered in different layers. We have, how strong is his grip on the bureaucracy? That is the number one question. The second question is, how much is he in tune with the opinion of the voters on a sociological level? And there is nothing in the surveys in Turkey that indicate that his grip on power in the sociological sense would be threatened. He has a firm grip on the electorate. That is number one. Whether or not he has a firm grip on the bureaucracy is an altogether different question. Returning to the coup attempt, it could be described broadly or in a schematic way as a fight between pro-American Gülenists and anti-American Eurasians, the main two factions of the Turkish military. And the ones that lost were obviously the pro-American Gülenists. So that, as far as I can tell, the strong faction in the military today, on which Erdogan relies, is what would we call the Eurasian faction that wants to orient Turkey, not necessarily break Turkey's relations with NATO, but orient Turkey more towards Russia and China. And this nationalist faction is on whom Erdogan relies today. Just as he relies on the nationalist opinion among the electorate to preserve his power. So in an ironic way, when Erdogan came to power 15 years ago, he was, in a sense, made by America. He represented a pro-American drive. He was leading a coalition of liberals and the middle class, Kurds, who wanted to orient Turkey toward the West. And his enemies were exactly those with whom he is allied today. The Eurasians, the anti-NATO, the anti-American faction, the ones who want to orient Turkey toward Russia and China. And today, after the coup attempt, he has switched his costume. He is maintaining his power by leading or by kind of teaming up with his former foes. And it has been a totally dramatic shift. And now the question is, how firm is his grip on power? As long as he plays the nationalist card, I would say that this grip on power is quite strong. But the military, on the faction on which he relies today, is a faction that owes him no loyalty. Because these guys who saved him on July 15 were actually the officers whom he had purged a couple of years ago, together with the Gülenists. So these guys have no reason to feel any kind of loyalty toward Erdogan. As long as he plays their game, I would say, he can preserve his power. But he is riding the tiger.
Okay. Bilge, would you like to weigh in on the challenges that Erdogan is facing from the military, from his own party, from the opposition?
Right. Well, I think, all these actors, we should deal with them separately, because all these actors, his own party has been going through quite different transformations in the last couple of years. And starting with the AKP itself, it is quite difficult to gauge what's going on inside the party, because AKP is not known for its very transparent intra-party politics. It's quite difficult to gauge what's going on inside the party. But what is known is that there has been a kind of increasing discontent with how Erdogan is tackling with the issues, intra-party and domestic issues. And we know that this has been very obvious with the Gezi demonstrations. Back then, the Abdullah Gül, the president, challenged him on the police brutality in a direct contradiction with Erdogan. And then following that, there was Bülent Arınç challenging him in a way, perhaps not very directly and openly, but he was very vocal about the end of the Kurdish peace process, about the corruption scandal. Davutoğlu, again, these prominent figures within the party, that he had some disagreements over him over the issues of EU integration. And of course, quite contrary to the expectations, then these figures that they settled with their face in the end, they were sidelined within the party. So I think the expectation that the intra-party politics would eventually challenge Erdogan by giving a way to a split within the party is quite difficult to expect. But in my opinion, what would challenge as intra-party politics Erdogan is where the party organization is now heading to. Because after all these sidelining of the prominent figures, what is left for Erdogan is nothing but a bunch of Erdogan loyalists, and composed of his relatives, and then the staunch Erdoganists supported by, more or less they have a vested interest in the continuation of the AKP, because they have been reliant on the distribution of the perks and benefits by the leader. And this is quite challenging in the long term, of course, because you cannot sustain the party structure like that on a total loyalty and unconditional loyalty to the leader, because it would be difficult to keep the party structure organization based on the charisma of Erdogan in the long term. Well, of course, that then one can say that the party organization is not important at all. Erdogan has been in charge of power for a long time, as deciding the agenda, deciding the policy goals, even scrutinizing the implementation, distributing benefits and distributing punishment for disloyalty as well. But what I would say is that party organization is still important for the AKP at the local level as well, to keep the electorate mobilized, to keep the patronage networks with the electorate, to keep the elite coalition behind the party intact. So Erdogan is very much aware of this, but in the long term, I'm not sure how he can handle this kind of incompetent, even unreliable party organization. And the loyalty to Erdogan should be also, the basis of the loyalty to Erdogan should be also questioned, in my opinion, like as we've seen in the latest forced resignation of the mayors of Ankara, Istanbul, and other prominent cities, that being a staunch Erdoganist is not enough to keep hold on the power at the personal level. So you are subject to the whims of the leader for the distribution of perks and benefits. So this might be in the long term a challenge from intra-party politics, how to keep a grip on power without a strong party structure. Coming to the military, I think I would agree with Halil, but perhaps one caveat, of course, who replaced Gülenists within the army can be further disastrous. In the end, that there is this claim that there is this deep state structures with sympathy towards counter-guerrilla paramilitary tactics against the Kurdish population is taking over the army, and eventually they would be keen to oust Erdogan himself. Of course, this is based on the assumption that the deep state structures within the army has been intact in the last 10 years, I don't know, since the Ergenekon and Balyoz trials, and this is to be seen in my opinion. But coming to the opposition, I would like to more touch to the opposition. Perhaps we should be talking about oppositions in Turkey, because there is a rising discontent, but they are not a unifying bloc. We know that the parliamentary opposition has been in disarray for a long time. CHP, the major opposition party, it's been very inefficient in raising a challenge against Erdogan. Maybe only very recently they have been making some political gains through this justice march and trying to capitalize on more cross-cutting issues like the demand for justice, restoration of the rule of law, basic freedoms. HDP has another story. Of course, they have been incapacitated to raise a challenge to Erdogan. Of course, the parliamentary opposition, political opposition has been in disarray, but I don't want to depict a completely pessimist picture here. And I agree with Svante when he said, like, the Western media, Western observers are so obsessed with what Erdogan says and does strategically, and then they often forget that there is a civic opposition very much intact, has never been dismantled totally. In my opinion, the referendum results, despite all the oppression, all the biased media, was a major challenge for Erdogan. The results from the metropolitan areas, it was a major challenge for Erdogan. Despite the biased media, biased electoral board, the margin for the yes vote was so tiny and ostensibly disputed, and this was a major challenge. Again, it often eludes from the Western attention that civic reaction, civic protest has become almost an everyday phenomena in Turkey. It can take a street demonstration by women's organization against a draft law. It can take in a distant Anatolian town a citizens network protesting against a construction project that would eventually destroy the livelihoods and environment of the population there. It can take like the forms of, I don't know, arts and mock awards, graffiti. I think these are the reasons to be hopeful and to keep paying attention that the authoritarian leading regime would never be consolidated, would be always on the defensive side, because they cannot finally and perpetually penetrate into the social and sociologically into completely, they cannot control the society. So maybe I should leave it there, but I think there are challenges. Yeah,
Indeed. Svante, anything to weigh in?
No.
Nope. All right. Then I would like to turn our focus to the newly launched Good Party, which was launched on October 25th, and some people say that it could challenge Erdogan's grip on power. Bilge, could you just give me a background on its ideology and base?
Well, as you said, it is a very new party, and it's quite difficult to make a decisive judgment on that. But I think, well, we can securely say that it does not offer a new ideological line. I mean, that would distinguish it eventually from within the Turkish party system. I mean, we have a few documents from the party and the speech by the leader at the opening ceremony of the party that obviously it is a center-right party, or tries to position itself as a center-right party, so it embraces Turkish nationalism and conservatism ideologically, and true to its root, it also embraces Islam. It's just considered as a founding principle of the Turkishness, the Turkish identity. But perhaps one of the novelties is for a center-right nationalist party is the emphasis on women, which is the action as own effect as a female party leader. But other than that, what it does is that it's trying to capitalize on the rising discontent across parties, more or less, and trying to provide a center-right alternative to challenge AKP from power. But when it comes to the electoral base, of course, this is to be seen. Definitely, it will capitalize on the voters from MHP, which was seen, obviously, that there is this rising discontent within MHP seen during the referendum campaign, but also most probably from the main opposition party, Republican People's Party, CHP, and even the supporters of the CHP would be, I think, wouldn't hesitate to support her, who think that they eventually Kılıçdaroğlu, their leader, has no chance to stand against Erdogan, particularly in the presidential race. But eventually, maybe last thing, that its support, its electoral success will be based on to what extent it will be able to dent in the AKP's electorate. which is more challenging because, speaking in the political science terminology, AKP, in Turkey in general, we have a very consolidated electoral market, which is quite difficult in the last 10, 15 years. So it would be quite difficult. One caveat may be the economy, because AKP has created this myth that without AKP there won't be any economic growth, any stability anymore. And thanks to that, it has created a loyal conservative middle class in support of the urban and the rural poor. But if the economy is going to struggle with rising inflation and unemployment, maybe this rhetoric, this promise of change on the side of the good party might resonate with the broader electorate. But this is to be seen, really.
Halil, does this party represent anything new?
No, I agree totally with what Bilge said. It doesn't represent anything new at all. And of course, the question, we have this title today, is there any hope for democracy in Turkey? And if you I have just spent the last couple of months writing a book titled "Why is Turkey Authoritarian?" where I tried to kind of look back 200 years and come up with some answers. And if you take that long-term look at it at the longue durée, as the French say, there is actually little hope that we can answer that question in an affirmative way. No, I would say there is not much hope for democratization in Turkey, judging by the heritage that is, looking at the historical longue durée. And more specifically, I think that this good party, the reason why it is so interesting to see Western media, Economist the other day, a couple of months ago, Financial Times are kind of marketing her just the way that Erdogan was marketed by Western media 15 years ago. It's always some right-wing leader in Turkey that catches the attention of Western media and is promoted as the hope for democracy in Turkey. We have seen this, we have seen this film many times over. This is just the same old film, and nothing's going to change. Because the question that no one seems to kind of reflect over is the question is there, can we expect, why do we keep expecting liberalization and democratization from right-wing authoritarians? The leader of the good party, Meral Aksener, she started her career as an interior minister, right-wing interior minister in the 1990s, when she was responsible when the Turkish state carried out a massive wave of assassinations of Kurds, the dirty war, another chapter of the dirty war that the Turkish state has kept, waging on its population during its existence. Its chapter during the 1990s was headed by Meral Aksener as interior minister. She is referred to as Asena, a she-wolf. Her party, their idol is this grey wolf that Turkish nationalists revere. And she makes this symbol, wolf, the nationalist wolf symbol in her meetings, the very notion that a person that stands for this kind of an ideal in any kind of normal European setting, she would have been written off as a far-right nationalist, untouchable. But when it comes to Turkey, then she is the hope of democracy, according to Financial Times or The Economist. No. I think, if you want my opinion, as long as there is no democratic leftist alternative in Turkey, a social democratic alternative, there will be no hope for democracy in Turkey, because that is what we see. My book is titled as Why Turkey is Authoritarian, subtitled Right-Wing Rule from Atatürk to Erdogan. Turkey has been ruled by the right from the beginning to the end. And the left has been crushed by secularists and Islamists alike. And this is the main reason why democracy keeps eluding Turkey. And number one, because the left has been crushed, oppressed severely. And number two, also because what passes for left in Turkey is genetically wrongly coded from the beginning. because people who define themselves as left in Turkey do it in such a way that alienates the broad masses of the population from them. So there are two reasons for why the left has not been able to become an alternative in Turkey. And there are no signs whatsoever on the horizon that this story is going to change in any time soon.
All right, so a rather bleak outlook from Halil there. What do you think, Svante? Could the Good Party challenge AKP with the next election?
Well, I mean, I think, while agreeing with most of what Halil said, I think there is the atmosphere in Turkey has become such that in the short term, electorally, unless you are basically playing either an Islamist or a nationalist card, it's very difficult to win any election, let alone reach the 10% threshold in an election. So paradoxically, in this very poisoned environment, Aksener has the right makeup to actually get votes. I say that while agreeing in principle with what Halil said. Now, the problem is, or rather, what suggests that they might have a future is that there is discontent in society with the AKP. I think internal AKP polls recently that have leaked out showed that they have about 35% support in the population. They may get more when there's an actual election. But there is room for an alternative, especially because the Nationalist Party has basically given up its identity under Bahçeli and become a support party to the AKP. So why would you vote for them? Why not vote for the real thing and vote for the AKP? The problem is, of course, that you have two nationalist parties now competing against each other. You have a 10% threshold. Neither of them may actually pass that threshold. And that would even strengthen the dominance of the AKP in the system. And I think Erdogan himself has a lot of instruments, legal instruments, propaganda instruments, administrative instruments to ensure that he can manipulate between these weak opposition parties. And in that sense, what appears to be a kind of a hope for a new leader to challenge Erdogan could turn out to be exactly the opposite. But it's too early to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I agree mostly with that, but the main thing is today is, of course, we have to look at the sociological level, we have to look at what's happening in the state apparatus, in the bureaucracy, and we also have to look at the foreign relations of Turkey. And what's happening today with the crisis that builds up, and possibly a strategic earthquake is on the way in the Turkish relations with the West, is going to have a deep effect on voter behavior as well. I would say, to put it very shortly, as long as Erdogan continues to embody the nationalist resistance of Turkey, resistance against opposition to the Kurds, resistance to the NATO, to the schemes of the Western world against Turkey, as long as he embodies that hope or that line, he has a good chance of, and his party has a good chance of preserving its power. Because he has tapped into that, as I said before. He came to power as the so-called liberal sort of hope, leading a liberal coalition. And today he is leading he's leading a conservative nationalist coalition, which means that there's very little room, as I see it, for Meral Aksener, for the Good Party, to actually challenge Erdogan. Because their electorate, this nationalist conservative electorate, he has laid claim to that. And so as long as it continues like that, and I would also say that as long as Western allies of Turkey, the United States, EU countries, the NATO, continue in a way of kind of attacking Turkey, giving the impression that they are trying to remove Erdogan from power. As long as the Western countries continue to give that impression, that is going to serve Erdogan extremely well. Because what we see today, a couple of days ago, after the scandal in Norway, during the NATO summit, NATO maneuver, you could see on social media in Turkey how people from the nationalist left, from the nationalist right, Islamists, all gathered, coalesced around the president as a symbol of the national pride of Turkey and nationalism. So it's very interesting to see, and I should say that those in the West who entertain any kind of notions that if we remove Erdogan, some pro-Western guy is going to come and replace him, they are deluded. To put it very, very, very a little strongly. This is not going to happen because this, of course, as I kind of connect to what I said, there is, of course, no hope for left or social democracy in Turkey. Turkey is going nationalism, hardline conservatism and nationalism continues to have a bright future in Turkey. Whether this is going to be embodied by Erdogan or someone else, I don't know. Of course, someone eventually is going to replace him. But the basic kind of change that is happening in Turkey, the shift of Turkey's strategic identity away from the West, that is going to continue post-Erdogan.
Would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Well, I agree what Svante said, that there is a rising discontent with the AKP on many different sides of the political spectrum, but I mean, good party, whether it can bring all these different factions together, because they have all different visions. There is the Kurds disappointed with the AKP, there is a CHP, obviously, voters more on the center left, so-called, and also on the side of the AKP, but how to bring them together through one discourse, one political agenda is extremely challenging, and we don't know.
That is very challenging for a she-wolf, I would say.
As well.
All right, so let's focus a bit more on the Kurdish issue now. Bilge, could you just give us your view on how that issue fits into this context?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most challenging questions, regardless of from which point of view, which actor's point of view you look at the issue. I mean, it's complicated. It has become even more complicated in the last couple of years. I mean, talking about the right-wing dominance of right-wing politics in Turkey, I mean, we have seen that recently the ideological or whatever difference between AKP and MHP, more far-right nationalist wing, has been almost non-existing now. The AKP has made a complete U-turn from its earlier claim to bring a peaceful and lasting solution to the Kurdish issue. Now they have embraced MHP's line, saying that now it is all about the problem in the southeast. They don't even want to mention Kurdish issue or Kurdish problem. And what they have been promoting, we will promote this equal citizenship and individual rights on the basis of the equal citizenship. And this is another way to say that, no, we deny minority rights, we deny group representation. And this is not even novel, that the right-wing parties have been doing it for a long time in Turkey anyway. And CHP, the Republican parties, another issue, that they have been divided on the issue so much between the statist nationalist camp and the more maybe progressive ones within them. But this division of the intra-party politics have prevented them to offer any breakthrough on the issue of the Kurdish question. What is perhaps important, whether or not Erdogan will win the presidential race in 2019, is the long-term issue of the Kurdish question that goes beyond the short-term electoral gains. I mean, what happened in the last couple of years since the June 2015 elections have been traumatic for the Kurdish population. And first, the 2015 elections, the legitimate results of the legitimate elections have been ignored. Then their legitimately elected representatives at local level, at central level, have been jailed and removed from power. And this has, of course, created, and by a political actor which actually sacralizes national will, the election results, and this has been traumatic. And again, with the resumption of the armed conflict, with the wars, the ditch wars under the curfew in the Kurdish cities, we know that it has been widely reported that the widespread human rights abuses by security forces have been traumatizing for Kurds. Of course, I don't know, I didn't do research on my own, but what I read from the humanitarian organizations reports that it can only contribute to the radicalization of the Kurdish youth in the long term. I mean, then it really erodes the common future, the will to live together, to coexist. I mean, this is beyond, over and beyond any particular gains in any particular elections in Turkey, which is very challenging, very threatening.
Yeah, I agree very much with that. And I would say that the Kurdish question is actually the mother of all questions in Turkey. Everything that is what poisons everything and affects, from foreign policy, strategic relations of Turkey and to the internal politics. This is the mother of all questions. And one reason, for instance, that the as I said, this anti-American, anti-NATO Eurasian faction within the military, which has now, on which Erdogan now relies, has gained the upper hand, is because the military has concluded that after first Iraq and now lately, most recently Syria, that Turkey's so-called allies are actually, with their support to Kurdish aspirations, pose a threat to Turkish national integrity. So this is what, first Americans encouraged Kurdish autonomy in northern Iraq during the 1990s, and now it has been followed by events in Syria. So this is actually, the Kurdish issue is the main reason why Turkey is being pulled into Russia's orbit, away from the NATO orbit. Secondly, Bilge mentioned the Republican People's Party and its policy toward the Kurds. It's a shame. This is a party that calls itself social democratic and which is actually a member of the Socialist International, which the Swedish governing social democratic party has left recently. Anyway, this party, but the so-called Social Democratic Party of Turkey, was instrumental in paving the way for the arrest, imprisonment of the Kurdish leader Selahattin Demirtas and his colleagues by voting for the lifting of their parliamentary immunity in May 2016, knowing very well that the whole purpose of removing the immunity of the lawmakers was to enable the imprisonment of the Kurdish leaders or the Kurdish politicians. So they were instrumental. The fact that the so-called left in Turkey, the so-called Kemalist left, they have a phobia, Kurdish phobia. In any reasonable, scheme of things, progressives from the Turkish side and progressives from the Kurdish side, Selahattin Demirtas and some from the CHP, would form together. Just a few days before he was arrested in November 2016, Selahattin Demirtas said, "Why is it our destiny to be ruled by, as he said, fascists? Why can't we come together in a democratic bloc? Why can't we form a democratic progressive bloc in this country?" And he addressed that question without naming it to the CHP leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. This is a tragedy, it's a shame. Because if the Social Democrats, the Turkish Social Democrats would have joined hands with the Kurdish Social Democrats, then you would have formed a bloc. I'm not saying that they would necessarily have been able to change and come to power, but that would have given a whole new kind of changed the game, the rules of the Turkish politics, the way Turkish politics is played. But this is not happening, and the responsibility for this is everyone. We are used to blaming Erdogan for everything. I would like to blame Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu for this. He carries a huge responsibility for the absence of a progressive bloc because he is the one who is, together with Erdogan and Devlet Bahçeli, MHP leader, responsible for the fact that Selahattin Demirtas is in prison in Edirne since November 2016, and all the other Kurdish mayors and other lawmakers from the party. So this shows how this Kurdish question, number one, leads Turkey away from the West. Of course, Western countries' behavior has also contributed, but it contributes to changing Turkey's strategic identity. And number two, it is the reason why, because nationalism comes before anything else, is why no progressive bloc is formed in Turkey that unites social democrats, democratic leftists, progressives from the Turkish and Kurdish side, because no one is, which would have transcended the ethnic divide. But as Bilge said, the two Turks and Kurds are drifting apart, and the way the Kurds have been treated, now Turkish nationalists take comfort and say that we have managed to crush the Kurds. I hear that from people in Turkey. They are very content in the bureaucracy. We have defeated the Kurds. And now Iran is also contributed to this with what happened with the Kurds in Iraq. So they feel that, wow, the nationalists in Turkey, they feel that they have the upper hand. For the moment, yes. But I wonder what's going to happen in the long term with what has happened to the Kurds over and over and again. And now, most recently in 2015, when hundreds of people were killed, maybe thousands of civilians were killed when the Turkish army destroyed its own cities, like Bashar Assad had destroyed his cities. The Turkish arms, artillery, air force laid Kurdish cities to rubble. And this is not, again, Erdogan's quote. Erdogan is just one part of a state that is genetically programmed to repeat this oppression over and over again throughout its history. So I would say that while focusing on Erdogan, let's not forget the other culprits, the other leaders who are responsible, leader of the CHP, namely.
Okay, Svante?
Yes.
Any comments?
Not on that particular point.
Not on that. All right, so let's say that the good party would win the next elections. What would that mean for the Kurdish issue? Turn to you.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons for the change to a presidential system in Turkey is exactly to deny the ability of the Kurdish party and the Kurdish electorate to have a real influence on the political system. And we can easily assume that the next president of Turkey is going to be a nationalist, whether it's Erdogan or Aksener or somebody else. And it seems to me that they would base their policies on more or less the same structures that are making the decisions today. By the way, I mean, Erdogan, even if he would like to, would not be in a position to change his policy. Let's say he suddenly wakes up one morning and says, this was a mistake, let's go back, let's try again to negotiate with the Kurds like he was doing, as Halil has written about. I think that would be probably the easiest way for him to lose power. Because at this point, the little dirty secret that Erdogan has is that he doesn't have enough people loyal to him to rule Turkey. That's the reason to start with why Erdogan had to rely on the Gülen organizations, thousands of educated young and old people who were very skilled, functioning bureaucrats. When he purged these people, he still, after 10 years, did not have enough people loyal to himself that he was able to put in position to replace those people. Therefore, he had to turn to the traditional nationalist forces that have been dominating the Turkish bureaucracy for decades, which means that they are now the ones on which he bases his power. And this is not only about the Kurdish issue, by the way. Other issues, for example, you find now that we now and then find hope in this capital, elsewhere, that there will be a breakthrough on the Cyprus issue, or that somehow magically Turkey and Armenia will once again begin talking about opening their common border. This is completely out of the question. I mean, at this point, Erdogan is in no position, even if he would want to make any kind of compromises on these key nationalist issue on which this nationalist bureaucracy is basically calling the shots.
Any comments?
No, it's absolutely. I can only agree and just emphasize that it was quite interesting the other day. Bülent Arınç, the former deputy prime minister and former speaker of parliament, he had been the target of some Twitter campaign from hardline nationalists, and he warned, without naming his name, Erdogan, and say that you have teamed up with this old deep state Ergenekon, and they are actually so they are planning for a future without the AKP in 2019. So when that happens, don't come to me and complain. I'm just warning you. It's quite interesting. What caught my attention was the way he used the word revenge, because these were the guys, the deep state or the nationalists, the Eurasians, whatever you call them, that the AKP together with the Gülenists had purged. Okay, and now they are back. They are the ones who are. Everyone was, it was so happy in 2008, between 2008 and 2012, when all the hundreds of military officers were arrested and sentenced, and now Turkey was supposedly becoming democratic. All these guys are out. They are back. Not everyone has returned to active duty, but in broadly, the old state is calling the shots, and so. Erdogan can only keep power as long as he does their bidding. As soon as he starts challenging, and that is what I think that is missing in the kind of Western understanding on what is happening in Turkey, with this extreme obsession with Erdogan. It used to be another kind of obsession 10 years ago when everyone was kind of hoping that Erdogan was the embodiment of democracy, liberalism. Everyone was, cheering him on. And now it's the other way around. Now he's the devil impersonated. So it's kind of going from one extreme to another, but the obsession is still the same. So we are missing the big picture. The big picture is that this is the Turkish nationalist state. And this state ideology is in tune with what a majority of the population thinks. Whether it is the voters of the Good Party, or the AKP, or the MHP, or the CHP, except for the Kurds. So you have a broad Turkish nationalist, hardline conservative majority. And the question is, how can Turkey escape this fate? How can this change? And I'm returning to this. This can only be changed by those who call themselves progressives, who call themselves center-left, who call themselves social democrats, emancipate from the hold of nationalism. As long as they remain true to Kemalism, to nationalism, as long as the Turkish progressive and leftists remain, first of all, nationalists, nothing is going to change. Turkey, there will be no hope for democracy. So instead of looking for another right-wing leader, grey wolf, she-wolf, whatever, it turns up as a hope for democracy, start looking for a social democrat. I keep telling my social democrat friends in Sweden, they should work actively in kind of working with people with whom they have contact in Turkey, civil society, social democrat. There are good people in the CHP who would agree with what I'm saying. We have to these are the kind of people that needs to be worked with. They have to, and it's going to be a long-term work. It's going to take decades, but it has to be started. Kind of cultivating those people and encouraging Turkish social democrats, Turkish progressives, to transcend the ethnic divide and join hands with Selahattin Demirtas and his likes. And it is so interesting, again, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the so-called social democrat leader, he protested when Erdogan removed the AKP mayors from their positions. He didn't say a word when Erdogan not only removed, but imprisoned the Kurdish mayors. So I would say Turkey's major democratic problem is not Erdogan. To be a little to exaggerate a little bit, but only a little bit, Turkey's major democratic problem is not Erdogan, it is Kılıçdaroğlu. Because Erdogan would not have the space if he had faced a real democrat as a challenger, a real social democrat, who would transcend the Turkish-Kurdish divide. And then I think that Western opinion makers, Western policy makers, they can make a little contribution by, as I said, by nurturing people, by cultivating people who are open-minded enough in Turkey, social democrats on the Turkish side, and encourage them to join hands and to care about the fate of Selahattin Demirtas and his likes. And instead of, as I said, once again playing the old movie of promoting another right-wing leader as hope.
Okay, so I should mention that we were supposed to have Halil Sahin here from Palme Center, but she was unable to make it today. But getting back to the issue of social democratic alternatives, Bilge, what do you think is the prospect of a social democratic alternative appearing in Turkey?
Well, I think Halil answered pretty much the question already. I mean, we don't have a strong social democratic background historically in Turkey. Every leftist movement or moderate social democratic movement were nipped in the bud throughout the history, particularly in the post-80 coup period. And left itself has been historically very tend to be factionalized. No, I mean, also like the violent conflicts within left itself, with some fringe movements, also like without any sort of reunification. And I agree that whoever wins the next presidential elections, this would be on the side of the right, unfortunately, without any structural critique of the system, without any novel agenda, unfortunately, on how the electoral system should be, how the new constitution should be designed. And so I'm more on the side of the pessimists about a democratic alternative. But on the other hand, again, I want to emphasize that in the last years, maybe the appetite actually for democracy and freedoms have been, in a way, on the rise on the side of the society. There were issues in the last 10 years, perhaps, that had never been discussed in the past. I mean, I don't only talk about the Kurdish or Armenian issue, but issues like women's issues that beyond what state feminism can provide to women, environmental issues, LGBTQ rights. People are willing to engage in those debates. And I think there is a bottom-up demand for alternatives in Turkey. But of course, if it is met by the supply side, it's another question. One recent poster by Konda, the polling company, revealed that 1/3 of the electorate in Turkey would be undecided for which party to vote. And they think that the system actors won't be able to address their concerns, their questions, and they don't know for which party to vote. And I think it's a huge amount of bottom-up demand for alternatives to capitalize on, which, of course, the current actors, the system actors, are unable or unwilling to engage with.
Okay, it's about time to open up the Q&A with the audience. So we will pass around the mic. My colleague Luke here has it. So I would just like to ask you to keep your questions short. And if you could state your name as well, that would be great. First question in the back there.
Thank you. Really interesting presentations. My name is Hans-Ingvar Roth. I'm a professor at Stockholm University. I have a specific question to Halil. And you mentioned the lack of social democracy as one of the key factors, hindrance to the development of democracy. But I wonder, it's more right to talk about lack of liberal democracy? So it's when democracy with rule of law, minority rights, etc., and you don't have to tie it to social democracy specifically. So I wonder why you emphasize social democracy here and socialism.
Yeah, that's a good question, maybe. But if you look at it, of course, first of all the things that you mentioned about liberal democracy, I include them in social democracy. So there's no opposition between the social democracy and the kind of liberalism that you pointed out. Social democracy includes that and adds the social dimension. Secondly, if you look at it historically, if anyone else has an example, I will be happy to hear that. But as far as I know, there is no historical example of any country becoming democratic, remaining democratic, when there is no left alternative in the politics, no democratic left or social democracy. There is no, as far as I say, no historical example of any country becoming democratic when the right dominates totally. And Turkish politics has been dominated by right-wing parties, it has been a right-wing regime from the start. During the 1970s, Spain, Portugal, Greece, comparable countries, moved from authoritarian regimes to democracy, made a transition to democracy. While doing that, social democrats played a major leading role. Andreas Papandreou's PASOK in Greece, Felipe González and his socialists in Spain, and Mario Suarez and a whole bunch of other socialists and social democrats in Portugal were the leading forces in transitioning those countries to democracy. Turkey, during the same time, the 1970s, was also experiencing something similar, with a social democracy on the rise, which was very much modeled on these other Mediterranean or Southern European countries' social democracy, and which had very close connections with the Swedish social democracy. It was inspired by the example of the Swedish social democracy. The rise of the left social democratic hope in the 1970s. Now, Portugal, Spain, and Greece were allowed to make the transition under social democratic leadership to democracy. Turkey was denied that right. The rise of social democracy in Turkey was met by fascist death squads, by the brutal military dictatorship eventually, and by the opposition of the United States. And they all, fascists, military, Americans, the business community, the bourgeoisie in Turkey, coalesced, came together to crush the social democracy and the left in general in Turkey. As I see it, and I explain it in detail in my book, the 1970s is a turning point in Turkish history. This was the time when Turkey had the chance, had the potential to become another Greece, another Portugal, another Spain. But it was denied. It was not fated to happen. But it was challenged. The forces that it challenged were too strong. And the difference between Turkey, the major difference between Turkey and those other countries was that the rise of social democracy in Turkey threatened the Cold War dynamics. It was believed by Washington to pose a threat, which was not the case in Greece, Spain, and Portugal. Because this threatened American interests, mainly. So what happened in Turkey in the 1970s the story did not turn out like in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, but it turned out like in Chile. Turkey had its own Allende moment. And the Turkish Social Democratic leader, Bülent Ecevit, friend of the Swedish Social Democratic Prime Minister Olof Palme, and he was even called Beyond the Allende by his right-wing opponents. They tried to kill him. It was a narrow escape. But just like in Chile, the left was crushed, and eventually we saw the Turkish own Pinochet, Kenan Evren, coming to power, a neoliberal dictator, nationalist. And so we had the same story. So when you think about Turkey, think about 1970s Chile. The parallels are very striking. And so back to your question, social democracy includes all the liberal values that you mentioned. If you can give me one example of any country in the world that has made the transition to democracy only and ruled by the right, I would be happy to hear that.
All right. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting to listen to you. My name is Yabancı. I'm from the expert group for aid studies. I just wonder, it sounds very depressing, what you say here, but what about the civil society and their role in this? Can we get any hope from their status at the moment, or can you please elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question because it directly talks to my own research these days. Civil society is becoming more and more complicated in Turkey because on the one hand we have this shrinking civic space under the oppression of the government, under all the discretionary implementation of the existing legal framework on the civil society, and it mostly takes the form of harassment and discretionary implementation of the civil society legal framework, as I said, but also like direct intimidation and harassment and arrest of civil society activists. And of course, the effects of this have been so far a kind of disintegration and fragmentation of civil society, of independent civic space in Turkey. On the one hand, we have a very active public sphere, that's true, like on the one hand, but it's more and more fragmented, more organized through low-key, local-level citizens, activist networks. And of course, it is good at the local level or at the issue-specific level to offer emancipation for their target groups. But we don't know in the long term if these organizations will be able to capitalize on more on the cross-cutting demands. It will be extremely challenging for them to, for instance, to shore up their organizational power, human resources, to reach out to, for instance, the grant-making bodies like the European Union. On the one hand, there is this problem, but luckily, civil society is still there. But on the other hand, which is not very much analyzed and paid attention to, is that there is this rise of government-dependent civil society organizations in Turkey that have organic links with the government, and it is, I think, one of the main challenges for the civil society organizations. And they are given all the legal and political means to spread across the Turkey, open up branches, and what they do, they act as the issue-based front organizations of the AKP, trying to trickle down what AKP promotes at the political level into civic and societal levels. And they are active in the area of women's rights, they're active in the youth areas. Refugee organizations is another example of these kind of like government-dependent civil society organizations. And they have created their own political economy as well, because they also act as the dispensers of the party clientelism. For instance, trade unions, like they do not only like they promote the government's agenda in terms of the labor rights and all these neoliberal policies, but they also like offer laborers, if they switch their allegiance from one trade union to another, to buy, for instance, very discounted houses in major cities. This kind of party clientelism is also now spreading towards civil society to different target groups. Mm-hmm. So there is, I mean, the judge is still out what civil society can do or cannot do. So there is kind of this kind of polarization within civil society as well. On the one hand, the oppressed ones fragmenting, becoming more and more local, trying to hide themselves. But on the other hand, there is very active government-dependent civil society organizations, which is becoming more and more complicated. So civil society is not like that, oh, we can go and just support the civil society, you can donate money to civil society and then we will save Turkish democracy. It's not that easy, unfortunately.
One quick point about that. Erdogan, it has been said by many that Erdogan's Turkey is becoming increasingly similar to some other Turkic countries further east in terms of how he wants to have this personalized system of rule. What we have learned from many countries, including post-Soviet countries, is that governments they have learned how to manipulate the whole civil society issue. Mm. And the problem is very often that, unfortunately, what we call civil society groups, thinking that we're talking in terms of Tocquevillian voluntary associations that are deeply connected to their society, are in fact not. They're in fact urban elites that are very good at writing grants for foreign Western organizations, not very connected to the demands of society, which makes it very much easier for the governments then to create an alternative civil society that, with the support of the government, is actually able to connect even better to to the real society than the, so to speak, Western-funded civil society groups. So I think that there are a lot of challenges in that area.
Now, to follow on that, now there are two catchwords here, kind of fixes. One is civil society, sounds fantastic. Another one is liberalism. Now, they are both problematic concepts. First of all, civil society kind of assumes that society, people in society are kind of assumed to be the the nice ones who kind of make everything's paradise going to happen. It's not true. What is it to say? What says that Turkish civil society, and so far, if you look at what people think, these are hardline nationalist conservatives. So you could say that empowering civil society in Turkey, it is already empowered. Its ideology is empowered. So what I'm trying to say is that to expect society to kind of deliver democracy and freedoms is an illusion. It's kind of based on the assumption that individuals want this. They may or may not want it. In the case of Turkey, they don't seem to want it. They are, as I said, did we see any kind of Turkish civil society movement when the army was laying the cities to rubble, the Kurdish cities? The Kurdish citizens were complaining bitterly, saying that no one cares about us. What's happening to us. No, that's true. People in Istanbul, Ankara, the Turkish civil society was happy and content with the fact that their own co-citizens were being killed. So there we go, the Turkish civil society. Much to hope from that. Secondly, the word liberalism. I'm returning to what Hans Ingvar said there. Now, this is also a thing that, one reason why Turkey is in the state that is, you mentioned the trade unions. One part of the thing was the neoliberal dictatorship that established in 1980 crushed the trade unions and instituted the neoliberal regime that continues to this day. Now, the fact that Turkish economy was liberalized has actually meant that the trade unions were disempowered, and that is also one reason why we don't see any left in Turkey and why we don't see a democratic development. So this word liberalism, used in the Turkish context, as it was in the Chilean context in the 1970s similarly, has actually meant the opposite of democratization. So both civil society and liberalism are concepts, they can, of course, work in a positive direction, but they are not, it's not self-evident. It cannot be assumed that they will promote, that this will mean, more civil society and more liberalism will mean democracy. And the Turkish example shows that this is not the case.
Okay, so I believe the next question was actually Ambassador Peterson. And then we had some questions on the left as well, or on your right.
Thank you. Then my name is Åke Peterson, and a retired person today. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion indeed, and very bleak perspective. So for Turkey indeed, I have to absorb it somehow, go home and think about this, because it certainly has not been very encouraging, and I hope to be more encouraged somehow. And I will have to do it by myself. But I want to return to the Kurds anyhow, because we are talking in a bit, and you also, Halil, about the monolithic nationalist Turkish society. But also, is the Kurds also as monolithically against Erdogan today? Meaning, how do you break down the Kurdish vote today in Turkey, before the elections 2015 and so on, and today, east and west, southeast, but also in the urban areas? Another question, obviously, is Russia's role here, because we have to remind ourselves that also Russia has, for many Kurds in Turkey, stood for some kind of support for the Turkish issue, for the Turkish question. And I can hear it among Kurdish friends also here in Stockholm, that somehow they have retained the hope that Russia actually stands for support for some kind of independence or autonomy for Turkish and so on. And I wonder how does that reflect? What do you see out of this in your observations today? Thank you.
The Kurds have, if you look historically, the Kurds they have voted for right-wing parties, and the majority of the Kurds, because the Kurds are mostly religiously conservative, and so they have been, the kind of natural constituency for conservative party ever since the first multi-party election was held in 1950. The first time this pattern changed, was in June 2015, when 7 out of 10 Kurdish voters voted for the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, which is not only pro-Kurdish, but it's also distinguished by the fact that it's a secular party. It stands for a kind of secular Kurdish nationalism. So it was the fact that the majority of the Kurds took crossed over to to that party, represented a major break with a voting pattern behavior since the 1950s, when the conservative Kurds went there. Now that pattern changed slightly in the following up election in November, when many Kurds stayed at home and some returned to the AKP because they were as a reaction against what they found, PKK's tactics, guerrilla warfare, which brought so much destruction onto the Kurds. So many Kurdish voters reacted by returning to the AKP or staying home. And today, actually, the survey suggests that the pro-Kurdish party seems to be more or less guaranteed to cross the 10% threshold. It still retains a significant grip on the Kurdish electorate, even though and that is, of course, a result that I think that what has not been analyzed enough so far is the fact that the warfare that restarted in 2015 really might have been a decisive moment for the Kurdish conservative Kurds. The fact that the Erdogan's and AKP's betrayal, that they turned against them, something was broken there, I believe, and this will be we will see long-term consequences of this, where the Kurdish, even the Kurdish conservative Kurds, not so easily returning to AKP or its or another conservative right-wing party. So we see a kind of gradual drifting apart of Turks and Kurds. Two, when it comes to Russia, I don't think Turkey is the reason, as I said before, that so many nationalists in the military, etc., are now moving closer to Russia, is the fact that they have concluded that sticking to the United States and NATO is what endangers Turkish territorial integrity. They see the alliance with Russia, now the cooperation with Russia in Syria, as a way of checking Kurdish, checking the Kurds. So they see Russia as kind of a partner in that endeavor. So, and I think that is a major job to be done for Turkey's Western allies, chief among them the United States, to persuade Turkey that they are not scheming to split Turkey, which is just a general perception. And so I would say that the Kurdish issue is ensuring that the nationalists will be empowered, hardline nationalists will be empowered in Turkey. It ensures it kind of pushes Turkey into the Russian orbit. Secondly, and of course, the third question is, what is this going to mean long term for the societal peace in Turkey? What we have not addressed today is how are the Kurds going to respond eventually? They are quiet now. They have been subdued. Their cities have been laid to rubble, and their leaders are in prison. And we don't see the Kurds taking to the streets. But is this the calm before the storm? What is gathering in relation to what's happening in Syria, Iraq? For the moment, Turkey seems to have succeeded in checking the Kurds. But long term, one might fear that hard, dire Turkey, difficult times are in store. When it comes to relations between Turks and Kurds.
Do you say something that Russia has dropped something of its previous discussion on the Kurds?
I think the Russians are extremely pragmatic and extremely. They view everything as being connected, from North Korea to Afghanistan to Syria to Turkey to the Baltics to airplanes hovering outside the Swedish territorial waters. All of this is part of a greater game. And in that perspective, the Kurds are an important part, but compared to the prospect of driving a wedge between Turkey and NATO, the Kurds are completely expendable. The notion that you could have this 70-year-old alliance between Turkey and help destroy the 70-year-old alliance between Turkey and the United States and get Turkey not out of NATO, but to be a troublemaker inside NATO, is an ideal situation for Putin's Russia. That means continuing to maintain all kind of links with Kurdish groups, including the PKK, including the Syrian Kurds, including, as we've seen recently, large-scale Russian involvement and cementing of Russian influence in Iraqi Kurdistan. All of these things are going to continue because, frankly, the Kurds in this region don't have a lot of friends. They'll have to take whatever friends come their way. And the Russians will be able to play that while simultaneously, at least as far as Turkey is concerned, playing the role of Turkey's friends and the guarantor of Turkey's stability, because that is so much more an important geopolitical goal for Russia.
Okay.
First of all, congratulations with the organization. I think it's extremely interesting, as usual. I have a question that's a bit on the fringe of the theme, but I'm going to ask it all the same. You referred to the excessive focus, the excessive criticism of Erdogan, and you referred to the problem being a bit more complex. And I want to place that in the context of something that you haven't touched upon yet, that is the relation to Europe. And there, I think there is room for criticism, but currently my perception is that Europe is rather charming Turkey, or let's say anything to keep the flow of migrants out. So I think the relation between Europe is a bit complex. On the one hand, there is the ongoing negotiations about possible membership. On the other hand, there is the criticism here and there of the current regime. And there is the great elephant in the room, that is to say, please help us keep the migrants out. So I was just wondering, in the local context, how does that play out?
Well, I think the EU's response so far to the developments in Turkey have been extremely disjointed, disappointing, ineffective, ad hoc. I don't know how to even describe it. I think I've been quite critical of the EU because EU has been so far the major anchor for democracy in Turkey now, even more than the US ever has done. And of course, we expected a more sober prediction, at least on the side of the EU, what was going on in Turkey. When Gezi demonstrations happened, EU was like, wait a moment, there was a problem over there? Like, why are you protesting? And we were like, yeah, what were you thinking? And then what came after when the refugee crisis in 2015, what I would call an appeasement strategy on the side of the EU for Erdogan's government. And they agreed on this refugee deal, which is an extremely inhumane agreement, horse trading asylum seekers based on nationality, which was criticized on humanitarian grounds, but also on practical grounds. And as long as Turkey keeps 3-4 million Syrian refugees, agrees on patrolling the Aegean, and then the EU is happy to keep the negotiations afloat, at least on the paper, in order not to annoy the Turkish government. And of course, then even worse, that the EU has tried to justify it based on cold realpolitik. It was the Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said when he was trying to refute the call on the side of the European Parliament to put a hold on the Turkey-EU accession negotiations because of the massive abuse of human rights and systematic infringement on the rule of law, he said, like, we have relations with dictatorships because we have to help organize and co-organize the world. Well, congratulations, you are referring to your oldest and biggest candidate country as a dictatorship while talking about organizing and co-organizing the world. Well, what about telling us how to reconcile both? I mean, it's extremely disappointing, but also, I mean, there is the camp within the EU seeming to support the end of the accession negotiations with Turkey, but more to boost like their culturalist, racist claims that they has always been questioning Turkey's place within the European Union. And this is, of course, now the authoritarian turn in Turkey is kind of used as an alibi to let's question Turkey's place in the EU, let's put a hold on the... I mean, in the end, this disjointed approach on the side of the EU has been also playing into the hands of both Erdogan for bashing the West, at times boosting the anti-Western, anti-EU public opinion, but also on the hand of the far-right nativist political figures in the European Union. And Commission has been, as I said, completely inefficient and incapable of and willing to respond to this.
I think just to add to that, there's a deeper issue here, which is that, and you see the same thing with Mr. Putin in Moscow. Mr. Erdogan has been in power for a very long time. He is a shrewd, skillful political operator on tactical issues. I usually say that Mr. Putin plays chess and Mr. Erdogan plays checkers, because if you look at foreign policy the past 10 years, Erdogan has made so many mistakes and gotten into so much trouble in the Middle East that could have been very easily foreseen. But that's another subject. But on a tactical level, he is able to take decisions very quickly. He's able to at least implement a lot of these decisions in a way that European policymakers are not, because the system is very slow, EU countries need to coordinate with one another, and so on and so forth. And that masks the fundamental, to use a Soviet term, the correlation of forces. And the correlation of forces is actually, Turkey is pretty weak. Just like Mr. Putin's Russia is very weak economically. It's the size of the Netherlands economy, but they are playing this mega role on the geopolitical scene of Europe, the Middle East and East Asia with that very little base, because he's a good poker player. And I think it's the same thing with Turkey, that Europe, if Europe was able to act as a unified actor, and even more if there was transatlantic unity in how to deal with Turkey, there wouldn't be very much that Mr. Erdogan could do to resist that type of pressure. Because simply, if you look at the dependence on of the Turkish economy on foreign direct investment, for example, if suddenly, let's take an experiment. In unison, all the Western leaders would say that Turkey is no longer, a safe destination for investments. The Turkish economy could tank very quickly. If, as a result of some of the court cases that are going on, Reza Zarrab and what have you, there would be some type of financial sanctions for sanctions busting that Turkey was obviously engaged in, again, the Turkish economy could take a nosedive very quickly. I'm not saying necessarily we want that to happen, but what I am saying is that if there was unified Western action, it's really Turkey that needs Europe, not Europe that needs Turkey. But Mr. Erdogan is able to make things look like that's the case.
I would like to disagree a little bit there. As I said before, civil society, liberalism, problematic concepts, that doesn't quite work out the way we always assume. Another problematic concept is West. What does it mean, actually? And secondly, the assumption that a unified West would stand for democracy. Well, look at it historically. With Western American interventions throughout the world during the 20th century, well, they don't quite bear up that kind of assumption. And certainly in our Turkish history, if we limit ourselves to that, American interventions in Turkish politics have certainly not encouraged, have not, been in any way helped democracy along. On the contrary, American interventions and Turkey's dependency on the United States and the Cold War dynamics have dynamited Turkish democratic development, as it did during the 1970s. So, even if there, if we for a moment assume that there can be something called a unified West, then we have to question why would a unified West want democracy in Turkey?
But that's not.
I mean, is there a problem? In what way is Turkey's authoritarian rule a problem from a Western point of view, if we assume that there is a unified Western point of view? I'm just thinking, these are concepts: West, liberalism, civil society. We throw them around and assume that they mean all kinds of positive things, but no. And as I said, the Turkish case illustrates that West, liberalism, civil society, no, these concepts have not those positive connotations, in the Turkish context at least, that we generally assume and take it for granted that they have.
There was a point that until very recently, there was very pro-EU public opinion on the side of the Turkey, but it was destroyed happily by EU in a way that is it has drifted away from the enlargement policy since 2008 financial crisis. And also, of course, the EU has been talking only to the Turkish government, assuming that everything was on track, and stopped talking to the civic actors, that stopped taking care about the public opinion. Then Erdogan used this space very well to manipulate the public opinion on the West, or whatever, on the EU at least. Perhaps we cannot talk about a unified West, but we should be expecting a unified EU response.
If you don't know anything about European politics, you cannot expect unified European. But secondly, and the Turkish public opinion, yes, it was pro-EU for a moment, but does that necessarily mean that it was pro-democracy, pro-liberalism, pro-Kurd? They said no. Of course they were pro-EU because they were expecting a lot of material benefits from this. We also have to, behind this, if nationalism, hardline conservative nationalism is so strong in Turkey today, this didn't happen yesterday. This has long roots. And then we have to question that brief moment that you are referring to, when there was a pro-EU opinion, when there was a sort of orange revolution in the making, as we want to believe. That has to be questioned. If you look at the whole, span of Turkish history and what has followed, this hardline national conservatism didn't come suddenly. And Erdogan certainly didn't introduce it. He is just an expression of it. So, again, and you said that EU doesn't need to. Yes, of course EU needs Turkey. You need Turkey to keep the Syrian refugees away from Europe. Of course, it needed Turkey. So it's kind of a, but of course, this is a kind of horse trading. 20 years ago, I asked Bülent Ecevit, who was then Deputy Prime Minister. He was in Stockholm, and he was here trying to, get accession talks with the EU, start them, etc. And I asked him, Mr. Ecevit, you are a very nationalist person, a nationalist politician, and how can you kind of combine your nationalism, I said, with the fact with your kind of pleading for EU membership, since EU membership means giving up national sovereignty, pulling it as the nation states do in the EU. And he looked at me and said that, of course, he didn't like the question, but he said, our economic interests require it, he said. Of course, he didn't like giving up the thought of giving up national sovereignty, but he also realized that since the Turkish economy is, as you said, dependent, so much interwoven with the European economy, that this was a necessity. So on both sides, of course, you could say that the economic interdependency between the Turkey and the European countries is something that kind of guarantees that the relation will not be broken. But it does not guarantee that this, but it does not necessarily lead to the next step, that helping Turkey becoming more democratic. Sure. That is sort of, but of course, so we have to look kind of more from a very cynical realpolitik point of view.
And from a real political point of view, an EU that could come up with a unified Turkey policy would be able to achieve certain interests, whether they are in whatever field. That doesn't have to be about democracy. But because they're unable to do so, that leaves Mr. Erdogan in the stronger negotiating position.
Exactly.
I feel like we need to have another forum on this, so I think we'll have to gather the panel again in a few weeks. We are running out of time, but before we end, we have been rather negative here today. Is there anything positive to be said about democracy in Turkey?
No.
Is there hope?
I would like, I don't want to leave it to here like really pessimism. I risk being sounding naive compared to Halil, but I don't mind. I want to emphasize the earliest point that the civic opposition, there is hope. There is people who don't want to be on both sides, and there is hope for it. I mean, you cannot tell the Turkish youth, which has grown up under the AKP rule, but you cannot tell them that why the social media has to be blocked in 21st century, why they have to control everything, why they have to refer every political issue through reference to Islam. And I think it's difficult to tell this to them. And the civic opposition is there, civic resistance is there. It has taken an everyday form. And I think this is the major source of hope that things won't be consolidated and it's going to be only a weak authoritarian regime, what we have in Turkey. I don't mind sounding naive. I know Halil has depicted a very pessimistic picture, but also I want to remind him that he also said that Erdogan does not have a very strong hold onto power. So let's keep hoping. Let's keep work for it.
But I also said that doesn't matter that it doesn't have a strong hold, because whoever will come after him is going to be the same. It's going to be same or the worse. So no, I see no hope.
Svante, middle ground.
So I think, very interestingly, the year 2008 was referred to before, and we've seen this. This is not just a Turkey story, by the way. We see everywhere that the EU was a force of attraction for Turkey, for economic interest, yes, but also that until around 2008, there was still this idea that Europe represented what Ataturk would have called the highest level of contemporary civilization. Mm-hmm. What we are seeing everywhere around the world now is this idea, this model that we want to be like Europe doesn't have that power of attraction. So what happens to Turkey and Turkey's perception of Europe, and therefore perception of whether we should at all be interested in democracy or democratic reforms or not, has to do with whether, again, that stays the case. So, for example, if suddenly we know, by the way, that all the emerging economies, Turkey lead among them, are extremely vulnerable in terms of their financial structure. If suddenly, the 2008 crisis was not a global financial crisis, it was a Western financial crisis that weakened the West, strengthened the rest. If suddenly, by accident, next year you have an emerging markets financial crisis, China, South Africa, Brazil, Turkey, what have you, because they're all over-leveraged and they're all in deep trouble. Suddenly, if you're in Turkey, the West is going to look much better again. So I think things could change very quickly.
But the West is not in a good shape either.
Well, but I'm just saying that the way that the balance of forces between Europe and the rest of the world, that's going to affect how Turkey sees Europe.
All right, we are officially out of time. I promise you we will be back again soon with another Turkey forum. There seems to be a lot of interest on this. We will be actually back here at Medelhavsmuseet on Thursday to talk about secularism in Kazakhstan. You can find more information on that on our website. But please join me in thanking our panel, and thank you so much for coming.